My name is John Asana. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. And today's webinar is titled Assessing Impact of Future Climate and Introduced Species on Hawaii's Aquatic Ecosystems. And we're excited to have Yin-Fan Tsang and Hannah Cleveland from the University of Hawaii at Manoa with us today. Now, to introduce our presenters, we have Janet Cushing, who is the Acting Director for the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center. Janet, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the National Climate Adaptation Science Center and the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center, I am honored to introduce our two speakers for today. So Yin-Fan Tsang is an assistant professor in natural resources and environmental management at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She's particularly interested in hydrological processes, hydrological modeling, and ecohydrological implications and applications to aquatic ecosystems across multiple spatial scales. Our second speaker, Hannah Cleveland, received her PhD in geography from the University College London in the United Kingdom, based on ecohydrological monitoring and modeling of river floodplain restoration. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So with that, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you so much.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for that introduction and also for this opportunity to present. Before I get into the talk, I would also like to thank our funder, the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Yin-Fan Tsang, Dana Infante, Abigail Lynch, and Aaron Strauss. So today, I'm going to cover a bit of background on streams in Hawaii, and in particular, the importance of upstream, downstream connectivity for fish. The talk will focus on two main topics: how streamflow is changing in Hawaii, and then the potential impact on native fish. So climate change is expected to directly impact the structure and functioning of tropical streams by altering the hydrological, thermal and chemical conditions. And stream systems in Hawaii are particularly important because they provide more than 50% of irrigation water to the islands. They're very, very important for agriculture. They host endemic stream fauna, and they also, obviously amongst other things, influence the condition of nearshore coastal habitats in terms of sediment and nutrient loads. So it's important to understand how climate change affects these resources. And in recent decades, mean surface temperature in Hawaii has increased rapidly, consistent with the global trend. And we know that this warming is already having documented impacts on the hydrological cycle. So recent studies have shown a decrease in the total amount of rainfall as well as the intensity of rainfall, and an increase in drought occurrence. And so if this is likely to impact groundwater recharge and runoff in streams. And indeed we have seen a downward trend in baseflows from 1913 to 2008, which has been reported in the literature. And so if this continues into the future, this has potentially serious consequences for streamflows and the distribution and abundance of native organisms. And just to give you an idea of what we can expect in the future, statistical downscaling and dynamical downscaling of global climate model outputs indicate that we're likely to see strong dipolar rainfall patterns. So with the wetter windward sides of the islands becoming more wet, and the leeward drier areas of the islands becoming drier in the future. So Streams in Hawaii are very flashy, as shown here in this hydrograph in the top right of a stream in Maui. And this is driven by the steep topography, the short peak-to-ocean distances, the low-order stream systems, and then intense tropical rainfall on top of that. So rainfall can exceed more than 10,000 millimeters per year in some windward areas, which is just remarkable, and it makes Hawaii one of the wettest places on Earth. So this is a map showing the spatial distribution of perennial and intermittent flow across the main Hawaiian island. The perennial flow is shown in dark blue, and the intermittent flow is shown in light blue. And you can see that perennial stream flow typically occurs on the windward sides of the high elevation, geologically younger islands, and intermittent flow and low rainfall occurs on the leeward areas. And so freshwater resources in leeward regions can be quite limited, and such that there's quite an extensive ditch network across Hawaii that's used to divert surface water from the wetter areas to the dry areas to meet agricultural water demands. So this has, as you can imagine, resulted in water disputes where in-stream flow standards have been impacted. There's rather a small number of taxa that comprise the native fauna of Hawaiian streams, and these are endemic to the islands. These include 5 species of amphibious fishes, 2 species of amphibious shrimp, and 2 species of amphibious snails. And these are distributed longitudinally based on their waterfall climbing ability. And you can see one of the better climbers here shown in this video that's Lentipes concolor just scaling a waterfall there. And so these migratory species, they lay their eggs in the streams, which then hatch and are washed out to the sea. And then they disperse and spend a marine larval phase feeding, and then before returning back to fresh water as juveniles. And that's where they spend the majority of their life, in fresh water. So unobstructed passage is very important for these species. One for the initial dispersal of the larvae, but then also for the recruitment of the juveniles later on. And so I'm just going to go over quickly some of the objectives of this study. Firstly, to examine the hydrographic record for evidence of changes in flow regime. And this assessment has been on the observed trends in stream flow over the last 50 years. Secondly, to determine regions where streams that provide refugia for native species may be more susceptible or resilient to the impacts of climate change. And this analysis has used species data for the state. And then a third objective is to determine future stream flow dynamic patterns across the Hawaiian Islands through modelling simulation. And this is something that we're working on now. So I'm going to get into some of the methods here. So in order to look at climate-driven changes in stream flow, we needed to identify streams that were unimpacted by anthropogenic influences, so namely surface water diversion. You can see a picture here of a surface water diversion taking all of the base flow from a stream. So we examined 390 USGS gauged reaches, and we also looked for streams that had a continuous data set and also a long data set, so we needed 50 years of data. And so based on all these criteria, we were able to identify 23 unregulated streams. And these are quite luckily distributed quite evenly across the Hawaiian Islands, and they encompassed a range of hydrological and climatological conditions, although we were hoping that we would have got more stream gauges in leeward areas, but that just wasn't available. And so to look at the trends, we used a parametric send slope estimator and a Mann-Kendall test for significance. And these tests are recommended for analysing environmental time series data, and they've been widely used for hydrological data. So for looking at the distribution of native species across Hawaii, we have presence-absence data from 9 taxa for approximately 10% of perennial stream reaches. And this included just 12 of our study sites, 2 of which actually recorded no species. And this is a wonderful data set, and we're very grateful to the Hawaii Department of Aquatic Resources and the Hawaii Fish Habitat Partnership for allowing us to use these data. And this was used in an ordination analysis, some of which I'll show you today, to assess species associations using the Kanoko program. Onto the hydrological modelling. So we've identified streams across the state, both on leeward and windward areas, again using more natural streams that are at least not impacted by surface water diversion or groundwater pumping upstream of the gauging stations that we're using for the models. So at the moment we're focusing on Oahu, and we've identified 3 watersheds that have also importance for native fish, and we have data available for them. So I've just highlighted Punalu'u watershed and the SWOT model that we've put together. So SWOT stands for Soil Water Assessment Tool, and this is a watershed scale model. It's physically based and it's fully distributed, and it requires inputs of climate data, land use, soils and slope. And we're actually very lucky that Hawaii has this really wonderful data set of daily rainfall grids for the state at a really fine resolution, which has really helped us with the model development and capturing those high spatial variability and rainfall inputs within these very small watersheds. So I'm going to go into the results now. So this is a look at the spatial patterns for annual streamflow trends from 1987 to 2016. I've got base flow, which is your low flow conditions in the top panel, and runoff, which is your storm flow conditions in the bottom panel. And this is superimposed on mean annual rainfall from the Rainfall Atlas. So the red triangles indicate declining streamflow, and blue triangles indicate increasing streamflow. And anywhere you see a black dot, that's a statistically significant trend. So what I want you to take away from this is that there is variability in the trends across the islands, but overall we are seeing that annual base flows and runoffs have declined across the Hawaiian Islands, on average 11% and 8% respectively, which is indicating a reduction in water availability in most of the study streams. And we actually see stronger trends in base flow. So we can see a significant downward trend in 50%, or nearly 60% of streams for base flow and 22% for runoff. We found that Hawaii Island in particular is exhibiting strong, significant negative trends in base flow and in runoff. Significant declines in base flow also occurred in northeast Maui and in all but one study stream on Kauai. But as I just said, these patterns are not homogeneous. So we see that declines in base flow were not significant in the majority of streams on Oahu, which had some of the lowest detectable base flow and runoff trends of all the islands. And so we were also interested in how the trends changed through time with the length and the starting date of the analysis. So here's the running trend analysis results. There's a lot of data in this figure, so I'm going to walk you through it. And I'm going to show 2 slides like this. So along the x-axis, we have the start year of the analysis. And on the y-axis, we have the duration of the analysis. So as you move along the x-axis, your duration of the analysis decreases. And we have baseflow on the left and runoff on the right. And each square represents one trend analysis. And anything in red indicates declining streamflow, and anything in blue indicates increasing streamflow. And then I've outlined boxes that show a statistically significant trend. And so what this analysis tells us is that it's not just a simple story of decreasing trends. So although, we do see decreases in baseflows, and they do dominate the trends and strengthen with time, we also see these, if I use my mouse, we can see these 20 to 30 year patterns between increasing flow and decreasing flow. And these broadly line up with the negative and positive Pacific decadal oscillation phases. However, the recent decline is not constrained to the positive PDO, so it does actually continue downward. And that's something to keep in mind as we look at the next figure. But there does seem to be some interdecadal variability that is driving these trends. Downward trends were most pronounced on the Big Island, particularly in dry areas, and you can see in this figure that it's very red. So we found that streams on the younger islands, so Hawaii Island and Maui, which have less developed soils and young permeable volcanic substrates, that these islands are responding rapidly to changing rainfall, and so consequently they're exhibiting this particular vulnerability to drying conditions. And so what we're concerned about is if these strong declines continue into the future, they may end up reducing water availability during lower rainfall. Another metric that we looked at was the number of no-flow days, which is important to understand for upstream, downstream connectivity and the maintenance of fish habitat. So if I draw your attention to the top right-hand figure, 3 of our study streams showed intermittent flow. And in particular, of particular interest is Kalianui stream, which is shown in blue. And this is a really pristine watershed, but it also has a diversity of native species and shows a degree of flow intermittence. So it's really interesting that, and sort of tells us that these that native species actually are tolerable or not harmed by a small amount of flow intermittence. Another stream to point out is Alaka High Stream, which is on Windward, Hawaii. And this stream, shown in red, has begun to exhibit no-flow days since 2014. And this is unprecedented in the 50-year record. So it's obviously something of concern and requires further investigation. Just as a point of comparison, I've included a stream in the bottom panel that has been impacted by groundwater pumping. And this is on the dry area of Oahu. And you can note the difference in scale on the y-axis. And additional groundwater well was brought online in 1990. And that had a substantial impact on the number of no-flow days. So this stream actually used to flow perennially to the ocean, but no longer, or at least it's during this period shown here, it was no longer flowing to the ocean. And incidentally, the stream has no native species present. But I just thought it gives you an indication of the impact that groundwater pumping can have on baseflows, given that I've already showed you the impact of some of the surface water diversions. Okay, on to the biological data. I'm just going to share one of the results, which is from a detrended correspondence analysis. The open circles in the figure represent the stream reaches, for which we have data for. And then the grey circles highlight the streams from the climate analysis, for which we have hydrological data. And then the triangles represent the stream taxa. And you can see here that overall we found two distinct groups of species associations among the sample reaches, which, as you would expect, indicates a degree of habitat separation between species that can climb the waterfalls, for example, Lentipes and Atoida, and the species that cannot climb on the left, Stegobius and Eleuterus. So this first axis explained about 30% of the total species variability, and does appear to follow a gradient in climbing ability. The sites in the middle have higher presence of different native species for our trend analysis sites, in particular Kalinui stream on Moonwood, Oahu stands out. The sites that fall out in the middle are where niche overlaps occur, and interestingly, these sites vary considerably in terms of their hydrology. Some of them have very high base flow, and whereas others are more flashy. And so it sort of indicates a similarity in community composition, which reflects the adaptability of the native Hawaiian fish to variable hydrological conditions in Hawaii. So I guess our goal now is to further constrain this analysis with flow data, which unfortunately we don't have for most of the study sites because they're engaged. So what we're working on is a regression relationship between rainfall and flow, so we can use rainfall as a proxy for flow metrics. Okay, so I'm going to get on to the last bit here, which is the modelling part of the study. So I'm just going to show you Punalu'u watershed. This is a really interesting watershed. You can see that in this figure here, the time series at the top panel, that this stream has quite a high base flow, which is caused by the presence of dike complexes upstream, which are basically low permeability volcanic complexes that perch the water table. And because of this good water source, the low-lying areas have actually been historically used for farming, and today the area is mostly used for small-scale diversified agriculture. But in 2008, which you can see down here, they installed a new ditch, which is, I don't have a picture of it, but it is a pipe intake, and it has substantially reduced the amount of water that is taken out of the stream. And you can see here for 2014, for which we have data, the percentage base flow diverted has been substantially reduced, and this is one of the best examples of an improved fish-friendly ditch intake design and management that we have in Hawaii. And I think that there's some capability of the intake pipe to be closed at night to aid the downstream transfer of native larvae, so that's quite interesting. So for the model, we've used 10 years of stream discharge data to calibrate and validate the models. And these years were chosen to capture a range of hydrological conditions that incorporated El Nino and La Nina events. And so this is a quick look at the model fit. And you can see that we've captured the timing of flow events very well, as well as the magnitude of base flow in particular, which was our focus for modelling fish habitat. And we have a Nash Cliff statistic in the region of about 0.8, which indicates very good agreement. And so now that we're happy with our model, we've started to perturb it with climate projections from Tim et al. 2015. And we're using seasonal rainfall and temperature anomalies for achievable minimum and business as usual, which are the RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And our current analysis suggests that this watershed might be fairly resilient to the projected changes in climate. So we were looking at base flow and changes in flow intermittence. And so this is potentially very important for providing refugia for native species and having high conservation importance on Oahu, given that so much of the island is highly urbanized and all of the problems that are associated with that. And so it will be really interesting actually to look at the stream that we're currently simulating stream flow for, which is next door to Punaluu. And this stream, which I showed you the flow intermittence data for earlier, already exhibits a degree of flow intermittence. So we'll see how this stream responds to the climate scenario. So with that, I'm just going to wrap things up with a couple of take-home messages. So stream flow has decreased in many streams across the islands. Of most concern for us are the streams in drier areas where they may become more intermittent. And while we can't really be certain that the patterns in this study are not attributed to a degree of natural variability associated with the PDO, what we can be certain of is that the declines we see in base flow from water diversions far exceed the percent declines that were observed in this study. So if we do want to buffer these systems against climate change, then we do need stream flow protection and restoration that's going to return flows and improve habitat quality for key native species. And with that, I'll finish up, and I think we're going to pass on to Infan.
Well, thank you everybody for giving us this opportunity to speak. So Hannah gave us a really good segue to a broad perspective of the stream flow for Hawaii. We see the decreasing trend throughout most of the area, most of the islands, and we try to understand what's the implication to our native species. And the following that we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about our introduced species in our Hawaii stream ecosystem. This work is being done by my student, Brandon Martin, and with a lot of collaborators, including Hannah and Rob Tingley, Dana Infante, Kyle Harriman, and Glenn Higashi. So what is introduced species? Introduced species are living, what that means is that they live outside of their native range, and so they have been called introduced species, aliens, exotic, non-native, and it has been a major threat to our freshwater ecosystem. Excuse me, it's advancing on its own. I'm gonna try it again. Okay, so specifically, the establishment of the introduced species is a lot of times cause the loss of our native species, because most of the time these introduced species have higher tolerance to harsh environment and is mostly competitive and have a wider food preference, and sometimes fast growing, and they have low age of the maturity. So the introduction of these species to Hawaii is due to the need of aquaculture or mosquito control, and sometimes sport fishing, or is the ornamental pet. And the result of it often becomes like the changing of the stream habitat physically and chemically. And given that we know that Hawaii has a really unique stream ecosystem, we also know that the natural environment in Hawaii has a really large gradient in terms of their natural factor, as well as their human disturbance factors. And at the same time, we have a really relatively fewer native species. So we really like to understand that how does introduced species, what's their habitat usage and what's their distribution for our Hawaii stream and its ecosystem. So before we go into that, we know that stream is really a complex ecosystem, especially it's in a hierarchical structure. For example, the basin, the reach, the channel units, they are in very different spatial units, and at the same time, they affect each other. So we know the habitat the in-stream channel units and microhabitat is very important. It's complex and strongly influence our local species. At the same time, those landscape scale basin and reaches is also affecting our habitat and in turn affecting our species. But at the same time, the human disturbance is affecting across different scale for our stream ecosystem. So for this study, our objective has 3 parts. The first one, we want to try to characterize the association between the species and the in-stream habitat attribute. We call it habitat assessment. For the second part, we want to characterize the association between the species and the natural and anthropogenic landscape factor. And then we call it landscape assessment. And for the last part, we will call it, we're going to model the suitable habitat for the introduced species using the landscape scale environmental factor, and we call it a modeling assessment. So here is the study area we have, the 5-man Hawaiian island. And as you can see, those blue lines are indicating the perennial streams, and the orange lines are those intermittent streams. My apology for the advancing clicker of my slides. I'm not sure what's going on. And for the biological data, though, we do have 2 different kind of biological data. One is abundance, one is the presence absence. And both of them are conducted using a snorkeling visual survey in the stream reach. So for the abundance data set, it is a stationary survey at the 1x1 meter point quadrant survey, and we have almost 8,000 of number of the survey. And the time was surveyed between 1989 to 2010. And we have another type of a survey, which is the presence absence survey. It's a moving survey across the 50 to 100 meter of stream channel, and we have 466 of the survey data, and it's expanding from 1970 to 2014. And both of them have at least 41 introduced species in those survey data sets. So, and here is a spatial distribution of our survey location. The green one are those abundant survey location, and the purple ones are those presence absence survey location. As you can see that they are distributed throughout most of the perennial stream, and some are in the intermittent streams. So for the first habitat assessment, again, our objective is trying to characterize the association between the species and the in-stream habitat. So we use the abundance survey and trying to associate them with those in-stream survey attributes. We conduct the canonical correspondence analysis, the CCA, and then we use the zero inflect model to fit our data as well for those taxa or species have at least 10 survey occurrence. And we use the distance to row and elevation to predict the 0, and we use stepwise reduction using the Aquatic information criteria to reduce some of the parameters. And the reason that we need to use the zero inflect model specifically because they are, this is using for some of the data set that is not fitting to the traditional normal distribution data, especially have a lot of 0 data. And this 0, some of them, they are true 0. What that means is that they are not suitable habitats for the species that we are looking at, but they are some false 0. And for our cases, those are the location that the taxa haven't been introduced to those locations. So by using this method, we can model the 0, the true 0 and the false 0. And then along with those abundant data, the taxa count, we can do a better prediction of the habitat simulation. So now here is our first part of the result. This is our CCA result. The arrow is showing the numerical variables, and the direction is pointing to the increasing direction. The red triangles are those categorical variables. In our case, it's mostly the habitat types. And the blue triangle are the species distribution. So as you can see that the dominant factor in all our data set that's describing our introduced species distribution are temperature, temperature, and the depth. And specifically, you can see that the American bullfrog and Pasiliid and tilapia that is in a higher temperature habitat, where smallmouth bass and the red swamp crayfish is in the deeper stream habitat. And at the same time, you can see that these are the groups that associate with the habitat have the gravel or the sand habitat substrate. And at the same time, we find that they are a group of species that actually at the center, which is signaling that they might be those generalist habitat users. And here is our zero inflated model result. The asterisk is indicating the significance level. And we first look at the our zero modeling, so using the row and the elevation. We found that the distance to the row is definitely signaling that how much the zero is happening. So the is further from the row, we have more zero of the species present. And the association between the present and the zero and the elevation is mixed. And for the habitat model part of the Tahitian pond and the red swamp crawfish is showing that they are more associated with the mid or large substrate. And for the American bullfrog, we see that they are more associated with the detritus, which is the organic decayed organic matters. So this is our habitat assessment result. Now we move on to the landscape assessment. Again, our objective is trying to characterize the association between the species and the natural and anthropogenic landscape factor. So to do that, we first need to link up with our spatial framework. Our spatial framework is based on this a framework that has been established previously for Hawaii fish habitat assessment. Our basic spatial unit is here, the pink reach, and there are three spatial scales that associate with this reach. So first one is the local catchment, which is the yellow area that are the area drained directly to this pink reach. And there's the upper catchment, which is all the area that from the stream network that drained to this specific reach. So it's including the green and the yellow area. And finally, we have this pink or reddish area. Those are indicating the downstream main channel catchment. So all the natural and anthropogenic factors is attribute or aggregate into the three spatial scale. And for our biological data, we link all the survey location to individual reach. And when a species is shown in the survey, we will call it as a presence. And if the species is not occurrent within that survey at that given reach, we call it as absent. So we conduct a forward selection CCA to select the landscape factors. And finally, we do an indicator species analysis, trying to associate the landscape factor with our species. Specifically, here's an illustration that we have, if we have an environmental gradient along this axis, when the species will show from the absent and become present, we call this as a positive increasing or positive changing point at that given environmental value. And on the other hand, if the species along this environmental gradient is from present to absence, we call this as a negative changing point at the environmental value. So here comes our result of, first of all, our forward selection CCA with the p-value less than 0.01. So from the, as you can see that the natural factor and the anthropogenic factor are listed here, the natural factor including the downstream channel slope, the upstream mean annual rainfall, etc. And then we have anthropogenic factor that have downstream row length and upstream pipeline length. So this is our forward selection CCA. So for our indicator species analysis result, here are the result of this of 5 natural factor, and let me walk you through how we read this. So this is on the bottom of the The x-axis is showing an example natural gradient, which is the upstream mean annual rainfall. And you can see different color of dots on the top indicating the species that is increasing occurrence or decreasing occurrence along the gradient. The red dot indicating increasing, the black dot indicating decreasing. And then the size of the dot is indicating the significance of the changing point, and the line is indicating the 95% of confidence level of bootstrap analysis. So as you can see for this one, most of the species is showing a decreasing occurrence along with the upstream mean annual rainfall. The exception is the Tahitian prawn. It's actually showing an increasing occurrence at about 2,400 mean annual rainfall. So in general, if you look at the natural factor, most species are showing decreasing trend along the local elevation, the upstream mean annual rainfall, and downstream slope, but it's increasing along the gradient of the local mean annual air temperature and the downstream extreme wetlands. So this is the natural factor. The following are the three anthropogenic factors that we want to highlight. So as you can see, most of the species that are showing increasing along with the anthropogenic gradient, including the downstream agriculture, the upstream population density, and the downstream road length density. Again, the exception is the Tahitian prawn. Tahitian prawn is behaved really differently from other introduced species. And I'm going to move on to the third part of our analysis. So again, this objective is trying to model the suitable habitat for our introduced species. The method that we like to use is trying to model their suitable distribution for these non-native species. Again, we are modeling their non-native range. The advantage of it is that we are incorporating some of the novel environment, especially when in Hawaii. There are other factors that is different from its native range, but the con of this modeling approach is that the species might not have been introduced or reached to all the potential suitable habitats. So I want you to keep in mind that there's a caveat here that our predicted suitability of the habitat may not be adequate, or it might be narrower than the actual suitability. So the modeling approach we use is the boost regression tree, and then we use the random temporal cross-validation to ensure the modeling quality. We select the taxa with at least 10 or more occurrence throughout our data set. So there's a subset of the species that we are modeling. And we use a selection of the predictor from literature, 3 of them, the reach elevation, the channel slope, the catchment area. And we select from the for Selection CCA, we select 9 predictor of the landscape factors that listed here. And eventually we use this cross-validation area under the curve AUC method to evaluate our model quality. So here is the result. So based on our model results, we found that there are some species model that is showing good model, which is have at least AUC larger than 0.9. That's the green swordtail and the tilapia. And we have satisfactory model that have AUC larger than 0.8, including Tahitian prawn, the western mosquito, fish, and Pacilius. And we also have some poor model, which we won't be showing here, but there are some inadequate data that we couldn't do a good adjust of the model. And we found that most of the important predictors, including the downstream slope, the local impervious surfaces, upstream mean annual rainfall, and reach elevation. And specifically that we compare the predict reach suitability along with our observed occurrence of the species. And as you can see is here that the Tahitian prawn that is showing way more suitable habitat than what we have observed. And the second place is the western mosquito fish. Now here is the spatial distribution of our modeled result of tilapia, and I'm gonna walk you through this. So So from the red, orange, green to blue, it's indicating the from high to low stability of the habitat of the species. And specific for tilapia, the important factors are downstream slope and the local impervious surfaces. And as you can see that most of the red area is at near the coast along the shoreline, especially in Oahu and Kauai. And here is another map for Tahitian Pond. And for the same legend, but then the important factor for Tahitian Pond is elevation and the upstream mean annual rainfall. And you can see that a lot of the red or orange area is showing at the higher elevation in some of the Oahu, Kauai, and along the shoreline of Hawaii and Maui. So just to sum it up, our study, first of all, we found that the water depth and the temperature are explaining most of the variation in our taxa distribution for our introduced species. And the species is generally associated with the channel units or the habitat types. American bullfrog, tilapia, and crustacean are showing very distinct habitat usage. And for our landscape assessment, the rainfall and slope is limiting our introduced species distribution. And for anthropogenic factor, population and road density is highly associated with our introduced species. And elevation might have to represent a mixed signal between the natural factor and anthropogenic disturbance. So for the modeling assessment, we found that the Tahitian Pond exhibits the greatest amount of suitable reach for the entire state of Hawaii. And we found that the tilapia stability were more limited to the lower elevation near the coast area, especially for Kauai and Oahu. So just to give you a preview about what we just recently accomplished, we was trying to conduct a waterfall assessment to evaluate if waterfall is acting as a natural barrier for the distribution of our introduced species. We used the Google Earth to identify the waterfall location. We measured the waterfall height, and then we're trying to use a landscape approach to assess that I don't know why it keeps working this way. We're trying to assess that if the waterfall is the presence of introduced species was showing because of the human introduction, or it was barrier. That waterfall has become a barrier that for them to climb up. So this has been a write-up and being submitted to a book chapter, a landscape approach book chapter to American Fisheries Society book. So stay tuned, and we will have more to report. So sorry about my crazy slide advancing, but I really like to thank our funders and our collaborators. This is a lot of work, but we got a lot of input and help to accomplish this work. So thank you. I will take any question if you have any.
Okay, and thank you for both of your presentations. We do have a couple of questions already. Our first question comes from Ethan. How were the streamline data generated? Field map or flow model?
So the streamline was actually starting with the NHD streamlines. That is a national product, but then it has been modified based on local input, and especially this was previous work that had been done to assess the stream habitat for Hawaii. So I would say that yes, it's a combination of both. So it's not just a model GIS work, but also with the local input.
Our next question, this one is for Hannah. Is there a good understanding of the minimum flow requirements to support the various fish species? And even with the current declining trends in average annual flow, given the flashiness of the streams, what is the likelihood that we will cross that threshold of going below minimum flows at the time for the fish that are migrating inland? At the time that fish are migrating inland. Sorry about that, Hannah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think folks are looking into in-stream flow standards. I don't think we have a particular threshold that we can say that these fish are excluded. We know, as I showed, that some degree of flow intermittence is tolerable by these species, but it might also, we think it could also be potentially beneficial to a certain extent if perhaps following a flash flood event, if you are able to, if that does move out invasive species from a stream, and those native species are able to inhabit the area, a small amount of flow intermittence might be beneficial to them. But I think this is something that probably needs further investigation to see at what point does intermittent flow severely interrupt the passage of these species, and I think that's something I'd definitely like to look into more.
Okay. And there's another question we have from Springer K. There has been some interest in removing invasive albizia trees, I hope I said that right, where they overtop streams in the eastern Hawaiian Islands. This could reduce N inputs and reduce spread of the invasive tree, but would expose streams to bright sunlight. Good idea, bad idea, thoughts?
I have to say I've never really thought about it in terms of temperature. I guess I would assume if they're an invasive species, then you would prefer a native assemblage in the upper watershed. Most of the studies that I've looked at to do with albizia have been associated with the impacts on flooding. In Van, do you know anything about whether they would substantially impact stream temperatures?
I'm not recording any study that have been talking about the temperature, which is a really interesting factor, especially we do see that increasing temperature in Hawaii, and how much that is really affecting our stream, that's a question. But I don't recall any temperature study along with our native species yet, but that's a good question. We should take a look.
I mean, I think there are concerns with non-native species impacting the hydrology in terms of the impact on evapotranspiration and things like that. So maybe that could be something that is important. Certainly, we are places that are aiming to restore native species to the upper watershed, well, to the whole watershed, but to the upper areas that are less impacted by people. So, yeah.
I'm impressed that the albizia is growing so well at the east high mountain Hawaii.
At this time, I would like to thank both Hannah and Yinfan for their presentation, and I'd like to thank USGS for their continued support of this webinar series. Nothing left to say. I would just like to say once again, thank you all, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.